Chapter 1. The Unfinished Testimony. A thin rain was falling steadily on the roof of the Palais de Justice as Maigret stepped out of court. The drops that fell on his collar made him shiver, but what sent a chill down his spine even more was the echo of a sentence he had heard less than an hour ago. We're at 8 o'clock. Definitely 8 o'clock. The neighbor woman said so in court, her voice trembling, but her eyes evasive. 8 o'clock in the evening. Maigret remembered clearly in the file that the accused was seen by another witness at that time in a bar at the other end of the city. He paused on the porch, took out his pipe, but did not light it. The street ahead was awash with yellow lights. Steam rising from the sewers. Paris was damp and silent, so silent that the gaps in his testimony rang out louder than the crunch of his boots on the pavement. Sir, do you need a taxi? A driver approached. Maigret waved his hand. He was not going back to the Quai des Orfèvres. Not yet. Something was tapping at his mind. Soft but steady, like the ticking of a clock in the middle of the night. A feeling that this was not simply a case of jealousy or bestiality, as the indictment described it. He turned and walked back down the narrow street to the house where his neighbor lived. The street lights cast long shadows on the wet tiles. In his mind, he put the pieces together: time, location, attitude, and the odd pauses in his speech. When he arrived, the second-floor window was still lit. Maigret stood below, looking up, his hand tightening on the hilt of his pipe. He knew that if he knocked now, he would not only open the door to a witness's apartment, but perhaps a door to another unsolved crime. And in his heart, a cold certainty was forming someone had lied, and that lie was powerful enough to change the entire truth the court had just heard. Chapter 2. Second-floor lights. Maigret rang the bell. It rang long in the damp space, then fell silent. Footsteps echoed behind the door, slow, hesitant. The door opened just enough to reveal a face, the deep brown eyes of Madame Moreau, the neighbor who had brought him back. The light from the room shone through, illuminating the raindrops on the brim of Maigret's hat. Mr. Inspector, it's so late. Is there something wrong? She said, her voice tinged with caution. Just a few additional questions, Maigret replied, his voice low and calm. as if there were no urgency. I fear that some details may have been left out of your testimony in court this morning. Madame Moreau opened the door wider, reluctantly. The room was small, the walls damp, smelling of tobacco and stale bread. On the table, an oil lamp stood beside an unfinished glass of wine. Maigret sat down in a chair and lit his pipe. He did not look at her at once, but glanced about the room as if letting time pass, forcing the other to feel uncomfortable. You said you saw Mademoiselle Lachaume at 8 o'clock on the evening of the murder. He began, blowing thin rings of smoke. You sure it was 8 o'clock? I remember it was 8 o'clock. My watch was right. She hesitated, her hands lightly gripping the armrests of the chair. Maigret leaned over. The clock is right. Or do you want it to be right? A flash of confusion crossed her eyes. Her grip tightened. I don't understand what you mean. Maigret took a small, folded piece of paper from his inside pocket. I have just come from the watch repair shop on the Rue Dauphine. The watchmaker remembered very well last week your watch was brought in for adjustment because it was running almost 15 minutes slow. Madame Moreau's face turned pale. The glass on the table shook slightly with her hand. That means, Maigret said slowly, if you saw Mademoiselle Lachaume at what you believe to be 8 o'clock, then in reality it must have been nearly 8:15. And then he paused, letting silence fall between them. The clock on the wall ticked as if trying to count the tense seconds. At that time, she could not have been at the crime scene as stated in the indictment. Madame Moreau turned away, avoiding his gaze. And at that moment, Maigret knew her story was longer than what she had told the court. Chapter 3. The Man in the Dark. Madame Moreau was silent for too long. Maigret did not press her. He leaned over and tapped his pipe lightly against the ashtray, so that the ticking of the clock seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. Finally, she gasped, her lips trembling. You don't understand, Inspector. I can't say that in court, not because I'm afraid, but because I owe him my life. Maigret raised his eyebrows, still keeping his voice even. She nodded slightly. A man, tall, thin, wearing a gray felt hat. That evening, exactly at about 8:15, I saw Mademoiselle Lachaume with him. They walked quickly under the street lamp, as if trying to avoid being recognized. Do you recognize him? Maigret asked. No, and I don't want to know. but I know he was the one who pulled me out of the Seine last winter when I was so drunk I couldn't remember the way home. I never saw him again until that night. Maigret noticed her hand shaking as she touched her wine glass. And you decided to lie to protect him. You don't understand. She shook her head, her voice almost whispering. When he saved me, he said one thing. If one day you see me, forget it. Outside the window, the wind swept through the narrow street, carrying the sound of footsteps fading away. Maigret stood up, walked softly to the window, and looked down the dark alley. A figure in a gray fedora had just disappeared around the corner, as if he had heard every word inside the room. Maigret turned back. Madame Moreau, if he has appeared here tonight, it means that this story is not over, and I am afraid next time you will not be just a witness. The yellow light fell on her face, and in her eyes, Maigret saw a mixture of gratitude and fear, something that opened up a whole new branch of the case. Chapter 4: Footprints in the Rainy Night. Maigret left Madame Moreau's room, pulling the collar of his coat higher as the damp chill bit at the back of his neck. The evening drizzle had turned the narrow street into a patchwork of light reflected from the yellow street lamps. At the end of the street, a tall, thin figure in a gray fedora was mingling with the sparse crowd. Maigret walked slowly at first, then with effort, keeping just enough distance to avoid being seen. He was used to this kind of stalking, silent as a shadow, blending into the footsteps and the humid, cigarette-scented breath of Paris at night. The man turned into a narrow, dark alley, dimly lit only by the light from a second-floor window. Maigret stopped in the corner, listening. The sound of his shoes on the wet tiles slowed and then stopped. He glanced in. The alley was a dead end. There was only a brick wall, a rotten wooden door, and a few tilted trash cans. No one there. Maigret stepped inside, his mind on edge. He knelt down and studied the wet tiles, the muddy footprints still there, pointing straight toward the wall at the end of the alley. He ran his hand over each brick, and when he reached the middle of the wall, his fingers touched a gap just wide enough for a human hand. With just a slight push, the entire wall swung inward, revealing a cold darkness. A cold wind blew out, carrying with it a musty smell mixed with the smell of rusted metal. Maigret did not enter immediately. He took out his lighter, casting a weak beam of light inside. The narrow, slippery spiral staircase led deep down, as if opening into the bowels of the whole neighborhood. Somewhere below, the soft click of an iron door closing echoed, and Maigret knew he was not merely watching a mysterious figure. He had just entered a labyrinth of secrets that had lain dormant for years. Chapter 5. The Nameless Room. Maigret's footsteps echoed down the spiral staircase, mingling with the sound of water dripping from somewhere on the ceiling. With each step he took, the air grew heavier, as if the breath of the city above had been blocked, leaving only the smell of rusted iron and damp, rotting wood. The last step led to a narrow corridor, the walls covered with mottled lime. A round light bulb hung from the ceiling, its pale yellow light flickering. At the end of the corridor was an iron door, without a number or nameplate. Maigret tried the handle. The lock turned. He opened it gently, and the hinges made a dry squeak. Inside, the room was just big enough for 3 people, with no windows. Just an old wooden table, on which lay a pile of wet, ink-stained papers. What caught his eye was the chair that was facing the table, as if someone had just stood up and left in a hurry. A cup of coffee was still warm, steaming lightly in the humid air. Maigret put on gloves and began to leaf through the stacks of papers. Many were handwritten in blue ink, interspersed with typewritten lists, names, addresses, dates. Some he recognized immediately: witnesses, retired policemen, and even people who had disappeared from the case files the year before. On the corner of the table was a thick, unsealed envelope. Inside were a series of black and white photographs, taken from a distance and under various lighting conditions. In all of them, the tall, thin man in the gray felt hat appeared standing in front of the administrative building, sitting in a cafe looking out onto the street, and in the clearest one shaking hands with an elderly woman whom Maigret had just met in the apartment on Rue Moreau. A faint sound came from behind him. Maigret turned. The corridor was empty, but the iron door was closing, and he knew he had no time. Chapter 6. Locked in darkness. A dry click echoed in the small space. Maigret rushed forward, but the iron door handle was cold. The lock had been turned from the outside. He pressed his ear to the metal on the other side. Footsteps were moving away, unhurried, as if whoever it was knew he wouldn't be leaving soon. The ceiling light flickered and then went out, and the room was engulfed in darkness. The smell of cold coffee mixed with the smell of damp paper became strong, making him feel uncomfortable. Maigret took out his lighter, and the small flame flickered, illuminating the table and the photos he had just viewed. In the dim light, he noticed something strange. All the photos had a red ink mark stamped in the corner, a triangular stamp, inside of which was the number 47. Number 47. This symbol had appeared in the secret files of a document smuggling ring that Maigret had investigated many years ago. The case was closed due to lack of evidence. At that time, some witnesses suddenly recanted their testimony. Now, the list in the pile of papers on the table matched the old witness list. He flipped through the pile and found a map of Paris, its streets outlined in red pen, centered around the 15th arrondissement. In the middle, circled in bold, was an abandoned building once the headquarters of a bankrupt shipping company. A metallic screech sounded somewhere, followed by the sound of dripping from the ceiling. He flicked his lighter, noticing a small, loosely grilled ventilation opening in the corner. This might be the only way out. Maigret took off his gloves, reached into his pocket, and took out the small knife he always carried. The sound of the knife scraping the net echoed in the darkness. Little by little, every sound risked alerting whoever was waiting outside. But he had no choice. Suddenly, a cold wind blew in from the gap, and at the same time, the footsteps returned. Faster this time. Chapter 7, Trace number 47. Maigret pushed the grating aside, his muscular body struggling to fit through the narrow opening. His knees scraped against the cold metal, tearing his trousers and leaving a thin trail of blood. He fell into a dark corridor, the moisture from the concrete walls seeping through his coat. The footsteps were now very close. They were coming in a steady rhythm, but Maigret realized that it was not one person, but two. They were spreading out, surrounding the exits. He walked quickly, running down the hallway, then turned onto a rotten wooden staircase leading to the ground floor. Halfway up the stairs, he stopped. Below, the light from a yellow bulb shone on the wall. On it, someone had written in red paint 47, with an arrow pointing to an old wooden door. He opened the door and slipped in. The room was small and smelled of tobacco and strong alcohol. On the table was an empty bottle of wine and a cigar that was still smoking, as if it had been hastily extinguished. Maigret glanced around, then saw a thick envelope on the chair. There was no recipient's name, just the number 47, and below it was scrawled, "Rue Moreau, she knows." She? Who is this? A witness, a mastermind, or someone who has long since disappeared? Maigret tucked the envelope into his coat and stepped back. But as he turned, the door opened. A tall man in a black coat, his face almost hidden, stood blocking the way. His hand came out of his pocket, revealing the shiny metal of a pistol. "You're going the wrong way, Inspector." His voice was low and hoarse, without a trace of fear. Maigret knew clearly that this man was no novice. The air thickened. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, like a countdown. Chapter 8. The Girl of Moreau Street. The pistol glinted in the yellow light. The muzzle aimed straight at Maigret's chest. He did not move, his deep brown eyes watching the stranger's every move. "Any way leads to error if you interfere, Inspector," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly, but not in a smile. "And if I leave here?" Maigret asked softly, his voice even, without a trace of trembling. Too late. He saw and held the thing. He nodded toward the envelope in Maigret's hand. For a split second, Maigret felt his heart beat faster. He knew too well. This meant that 47 was not just a case number, but a vital code in some network. "Who is she?" Maigret asked bluntly. "The one from the Rue Moreau." A spark flashed in his eyes, then died. He took a step back, as if to gain a foothold. "You will know when you get there, if you are alive." At that moment, a police siren sounded somewhere in the street, echoing through the half-closed window. He stopped, then turned and dashed out the back door. Maigret reflexively chased after him, but by the time he stepped out into the alley, the man had disappeared into the thick fog of the Paris night. Maigret stood there for a few seconds, feeling the cold creeping up his collar. His hand tightened on the envelope. Rue Moreau. The name brought back a faint memory. A fire in an old house many years ago. A young woman missing. And the file classified as no further investigation. He returned to his headquarters. In the small room, the desk lamp shone on the envelope. When he opened it, Maigret found 3 hastily taken photographs inside a corner of an old coffee shop. The sign is peeling. A woman in her 30s, dark curly hair, eyes both frightened and defiant. A consignment note with the address 47 Moreau Street. No recipient's name. Maigret took a drag on his cigarette, the smoke curling like fog in the street. He knew he had just reached a new juncture and a path of no return. Chapter 9. Number 47. Rue Moreau. The Paris morning was a damp gray. Streaks of last night's rain still lingering on the cobblestones. Maigret stepped out of the taxi and looked up at the narrow, dark Rue Moreau, an old scar on the city. The houses here seemed never to have seen the sun, and number 47 stood silently, its walls mottled, its wooden doors faded as if it had seen decades of silence. He knocked. The noise inside was slow, as if someone was hesitating with each step. The door opened slightly, revealing a thin woman, her hair pinned up, her eyes as cold as frosted glass. Madame Lenoir Maigret asked. She nodded slightly, not inviting him in, but standing across the doorway. I want to ask about a woman you might know. She used to live here many years ago. A flash of contraction passed through Madame Lenoir's eyes, but her voice remained calm. Many people have lived here. Inspector, I don't remember them all. Maigret did not press her. He pulled a second photograph from his pocket, the face of the curly-haired woman. When Madame Lenoir saw it, her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the door. She's dead, she said softly, as if talking to herself. Died in the fire. What about the address on this shipping form? Maigret held out the paper. She was silent. Only the old clock in the house ticked steadily, as if counting down to something. Finally, she opened the door wider. Come in, Inspector. If you want to know, it's better to talk inside. The room was dark. The smell of old smoke permeated every grain of wood, as if the fire had not yet left this place. Madame Lenoir poured Maigret a cup of black coffee. then sat down opposite him. "You don't understand," she began. "She wasn't just a victim of a fire. She knew too much about people who didn't want the truth to exist." Outside, the long drawn-out tram horn tore through the morning. Maigret knew that with that remark the case had taken a completely different turn, and that no one at number 47 was completely innocent. Chapter 10. The Name in the Ashes. Mrs. Lenoir lit a cigarette, her hand shaking slightly as she brought it to her lips. The thin blue smoke swirled around the weak light from the window, making the room even darker. "What is her name?" Maigret asked, his voice slow but sharp. "Elise Martel," she replied, almost in a whisper. "But to some people, she is just the girl. No last name, no past." Maigret jotted down in his notebook, "Why do you say she knows too much?" She looked out the window as if avoiding his gaze. "Before she died, Elise worked in a bar near the Gare Saint-Lazare. The customers there were all sorts, from sailors, black marketeers, to a few guys in shiny suits who everyone knew didn't make their money cleanly. She had a habit of listening more than talking, and then one night she came back here, trembling, pale-faced, and said if I disappear, burn everything." Maigret sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving Madame Lenoir's face. "You burned it." "There was no time." She swallowed. "The fire happened that night. They said it was an electrical fault. But I knew someone was in the house." The sound of shoes scuffling in the hallway startled her. Maigret glanced quickly out the window. A man was standing across the street, pretending to read a newspaper, but his eyes were glancing toward the house. "Do you have anything left of Elise's?" Maigret asked, lowering his voice. She hesitated, then stood up and disappeared into the small back room. When she returned, she had an old wooden box in her hands. She put it on the table and opened it. Inside was a handkerchief embroidered with the letters M, a few silver francs, and a folded piece of paper. Maigret opened the paper. There was only one scribbled line. "Tuesday night. Bridge number 6. Do not come alone." He looked up, but Madame Lenoir had turned away. "Inspector, that underground bridge does not lead to light. It leads to a place where people who enter rarely turn back." Maigret folded the paper and put it in his pocket, knowing that the story had gone beyond a simple fire. and the name M was now his only key to the truth. Chapter 11. Underground Bridge number 6. The night rain poured down on Paris like a thick curtain, blurring the street lights and making every sound seem to come from afar. Maigret pulled up the collar of his coat and walked along the street leading to the old port. Below him, the puddles reflected the flickering yellow light. Bridge number 6 is not listed on official maps. It is known only through whispers. An abandoned tunnel under the old sewer system, connecting the riverbank with long, disused warehouses. He stopped before a rusty iron door. The lock had been cut, leaving a smell of freshly burned metal. Maigret pulled out his flashlight and shone it into the darkness ahead. The sound of dripping water echoed from deep within the cellar, mixed with the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. His footsteps echoed in the cramped space. The smell of mold and old oil mixed together, making him hold his breath for a few seconds. White chalk marks on the walls stood out in the light smuggler's signs, signs that told insiders where to go. As he turned a corner, he noticed a glimmer of light ahead. Turning off his flashlight, Maigret slowed down, clinging to the damp wall. A whisper rang out, long and broken. Tuesday night, the goods will arrive, and old RM will personally check 'em. He leaned over and looked through the gap in the collapsed wall. 3 figures stood around a makeshift wooden table, on which was spread a map of the docks. One wore a leather jacket, his hood pulled down low to hide most of his face. But when he tilted his head, the dim light showed a long scar on his cheek. Maigret recognized him immediately. René Marchand, who had disappeared from police records 10 years earlier after smuggling weapons to North Africa. Marchand folded the map and signaled the other 2 to load the crates onto the cart. The sound of wheels grinding against cement echoed through the tunnel, then faded away. Maigret took out his notebook and jotted down notes. He knew he had just touched a deeper level of the case, and RM was no longer an obscure name. But he also knew that if he continued to follow the trail tonight, he would be more than just an observer. In the distance, the riverboat whistle sounded, a reminder that the time for action was passing ever faster. Chapter 12. The Sheltered Wharf. The rain had not stopped. From the cellar door, Maigret followed the rattling of wheels and the silhouettes of three men pushing goods through the underground passageway to the riverbank. The narrow, slippery steps forced him to hold on to the rusty railing to keep from making a sound. When he stepped out into the open air, he found himself in the old docks downstream, where the giant cranes had long since been reduced to rusty black iron frames. Like giant skeletons holding up the sky, the smell of river mud mixed with the pungent smell of old engine oil hung in the night air. Under the dim, yellow light, Marchand and his men were loading crates onto the deck of a small, ash-gray boat. The hull was flagless, its license plate obscured by mud. A man in a long raincoat was waiting, standing erect, giving firm orders clearly the commander. Maigret hid behind an abandoned container, watching. He lit his pipe gently, letting the thin smoke disperse with the rain, masking his breathing. He recorded every detail in his mind, the gestures exchanged, the positions of the containers, the distance between the guards. Suddenly, a noise behind him made him stop. A tall, thin figure appeared in his field of vision. Lognian, the always unlucky inspector, looked soaked, but his eyes sparkled with excitement. "I followed from the north, sir," Lognon whispered, "but it seems they are waiting for someone before leaving the dock." Maigret nodded. Indeed, Marchand and his crew were in no hurry. They stood waiting at the ship's side, their eyes on the dark river. Then, out of the rain, a white light flashed. A small motorboat was approaching. As the canoe approached, the man in the raincoat came down the stairs, held out his hand, and Maigret recognized that face. A person he did not expect to see here, Lawyer Deschamps, who had been defending a completely unrelated case that morning. The wind blew hard, carrying the strong smell of tobacco towards Maigret. He knew that this moment had changed the whole affair. Not just smuggling, not just Marchand, but a network that included people standing in the light. Lognon glanced at him, waiting for orders, but Maigret remained silent. He wanted to know, before he acted, where this shipment was going and who was waiting for it on the other end. Chapter 13. Night on the river. The night wind whipped against their faces, bringing the cold smell of river water up their collars. Maigret and Lognon quietly left their hiding place, following the dark rows of warehouses, avoiding the glare of the deck lights. The gray ship began to shudder, its engines roaring softly, its bow pointing out into the black waters of the Seine. "Shall we follow by shore?" Sir Lognan asked softly, his eyes never leaving the ship. Maigret nodded, his eyes following the sailors' movements. They loaded the last few crates, locked the hold, and then a man pulled a small sheaf of papers from his pocket and handed them to Deschamps. The lawyer glanced at it, then tucked it into his briefcase. The ship slowly left the dock, leaving ripples that spread out like long scars on the water. Maigret and Lognan crossed the wet ground and climbed a narrow path that ran parallel to the riverbank. The rainy night made the street lights look like pale yellow streaks, reflecting on the water, wavering as if trembling. The rhythmic hum of the ship's engines guided the way. Occasionally, the silhouettes of abandoned docks appeared, like silent guard posts of the past. At each bend, Maigret stopped, taking note of the location, direction, and number of people on board. Approaching the Pont de Grenelle, the ship suddenly slowed down. A rusty barge, apparently long anchored there, was waiting. The flashlight flashed 3 times a signal to exchange. Maigret signaled Lognan to lower himself, and they both ducked into the shadow of the ball. A new group of men emerged from the barge, dressed in a jumble of clothes, long coats, wide hats, and a few who looked like stevedores. They began transferring crates from the ship to the barge in a brisk but not chaotic manner. Maigret realized something important. This was not the final destination. The barge would continue, carrying its cargo somewhere. The gray ship could not reach perhaps a protected inner city dock or an underground facility. In the dim light, Deschamps said something to a tall, gray-haired man. They both signed a piece of paper, then exchanged a thick envelope. Maigret squinted. He had met this gray-haired man at a reception for the mayor of Paris. The rain began to pour down hard. The black water swallowed all sound, leaving only Maigret's rapid heartbeat. He knew that this had gone beyond the ordinary, and he also knew that when dealing with the world of power, every step had to be calculated down to every breath. "Are you going to call for backup?" Lognan whispered. Maigret took a slow drag on his cigarette, the smoke mingling with the rain. "Not yet. We'll see how long this lasts before the curtain falls." Chapter 14. Shadow on the barge. The the barge left the Pont de Grenelle in silence, slowly, like an old beast lurking in the dark. The night rain had thickened the air, heavy drops sliding across the river, mingling with the pungent smell of engine oil. Maigret and Lognan walked side by side on the bank, keeping their distance, their feet sinking into the wet mud. When he reached the old abandoned wharf, Maigret stopped. A thick rope, loosely anchored to a rusty iron post, shook with the waves. He looked at Lognan. Now is the time to try that stealthy climbing ability you boasted to your wife about. Lognan opened his mouth to argue, but Maigret's eyes silenced him. They both crouched low, clinging to the slippery edge. And when the barge tilted slightly against the edge, Maigret grabbed the rope and slid down, the tips of his boots resting neatly on the wet wood. A slight spring, and he was on deck, hidden behind a pile of crates. Lognan followed, cursing the wind and rain. The smell of damp wood and rusty iron mingled with the smell of cheap cigarettes. The footsteps on the deck echoed heavily through the gap between the two crates. Maigret saw clearly Deschamps was standing next to a man in a dark coat, his head covered by a deep felt hat that half covered his face. The man held a sheaf of typewritten paper, his voice low and hard. "We will send this shipment to location number 3. No change. Tomorrow night. The rest will leave the port of Havre." Deschamps nodded, but his eyes were troubled. Maigret realized that this was not just an ordinary smuggling operation. It was a systematic chain of transportation with many routes and many layers of cover. The foghorn sounded in the distance. The man in the fedora turned and entered the hold, followed by 2 men. When the metal door closed, Maigret and Lognan slipped quietly to the stern, away from the light from the middeck. Suddenly, a hand as big as a pincer grabbed Maigret's shoulder. "Who is it?" Maigret turned around. His eyes met the pockmarked face. A cold gaze. Before he could scream, Maigret pushed him hard, causing him to stumble and hit the railing. Lognan quickly covered his mouth, pulling him into a dark corner. "Lock him in the empty barrel vault," Maigret ordered. "We need more time before they know we're here." The barge continued to drift, slowly but surely, towards another port deep in the city where Maigret knew if he let them reach their destination, the truth would be difficult to bring to light. Chapter 15. The Intercom. The rain fell on the tin roof of the middle compartment in a steady rhythm. But for Maigret, every sound was a mask that concealed something unsettling. He bent down slightly, squeezed through the narrow passage between two wet crates, feeling his shoes soaking wet and heavy. Lognon followed behind, breathing lightly but quickly, his eyes wide with tension. The middle compartment opened up like a dark room, lit only by a yellowish electric bulb hanging in the air. The smell of mold and chemicals filled the nostrils. The packages were neatly stacked, but on a wooden table in the left corner, Maigret saw something completely out of place, an old typewriter. Next to it, a thick, cracked-backed notebook, open in the middle. Maigret put on gloves and turned the page gently. The handwriting was neat. Line 3. Paris, Rouen, Havre. Addressee A. Valmont. Codename Grey Roof. Below was a series of dates, each line corresponding to a shipment, but instead of goods, the notes column was filled with scattered symbols and numbers. Maigret recognized them. These were shipping codes, each symbol matching the cases of illegal shipments that had been reported sporadically over the past year. Lognon lowered his voice. "Do you know who Valmont is?" Maigret did not answer immediately. In his memory, the name was associated with an unsolved case from his time at the Port Authority, a person who had never shown himself, only controlled through intermediaries. A faint metallic screech came from the compartment door. Maigret signaled to Lognon to turn off the desk lamp. The door opened slightly, revealing a flashlight beam sweeping across the floor. A tall figure in a long raincoat entered, holding a compact pistol. The man walked straight towards the table, his eyes scanning the crates as if he knew the location of each one by heart. As he reached for the book, Maigret stepped out of the shadows, his gun pressed against his back. On a rainy night like this, "Are you planning to write a diary?" Maigret said softly, his voice cold enough to freeze the other person. Lognon locked the hatch, but before they could ask, a siren sounded from the deck, followed by the sound of running feet. Maigret knew his time was running short. Chapter 16. Stepping on the deck. The footsteps on deck echoed down the hold like a drum beat, each beat drawing closer. Maigret tightened his grip on the gun stock, forcing the stranger to turn toward the weak yellow light. His face was revealed a man of about 40, his hair flattened by the rain, his eyes as cold as steel. There was no trace of fear, just an uneasy calm. Valmont Maigret asked, his voice as deep as a ship's engine. He swas, his lips curling slightly. You know my name, so you must know you can't keep me for long. Lognan yanked his arm back, tying it with the rope hanging from a corner of the compartment. But then there was a screech of metal and the clang of a chain from the outer door. Someone had locked the compartment from the outside. Maigret glanced at Lognan. The tide had turned too quickly. In a few minutes, they would be cornered prey. He quickly removed the notebook from the table and hid it in the lining of his coat, where only he knew where. There was a triple knock on the steel door. Then silence. Valmont chuckled. That's their signal. They're coming to clear up. And you'll be gone, as serene as a night rain. The sound of metal grinding continued. Someone was using a crowbar to pry open the door. The smell of rain mixed with the smell of engine oil and damp goods, creating a stifling, thick smell in the air. Maigret whispered to Lognan, when they come in, you block the left. I'll lead him through the ventilations. Lognan nodded slightly. As the door swung open, a blinding white light flooded in, along with the silhouettes of 3 men in black raincoats, their faces hidden by hoods. In a moment of confusion, Maigret pushed Valmont toward Lognan, then pulled them both back against the grating behind. He pulled a pocket knife from his pocket and quickly cut the ropes that held the grating together, revealing a narrow passageway leading to the engine room. The sound of the sea lapping against the hull outside seemed to urge him on. Go, Maigret ordered. They squeezed through the narrow gap just as gunfire rang out, bullets flying across metal, sparks flying. In the muggy darkness of the engine room, Maigret knew he had only minutes to escape to the deck before the entire ship turned into a deadly maze. Chapter 17. The gray roof reveals. The engine room shook violently, as if the ship were trying to escape the invisible hand of the night sea. The heat from the engine blew into Maigret and Lognan's faces, mixing sweat with the salt mist. Valmont was dragged between them, still smiling defiantly. The sound of footsteps close behind echoed in the narrow tunnel. The sound of metal clanging against metal. Maigret gestured for silence. Leaning in to listen, the sound came not only from behind, but also from the left, where a narrow passage led onto the side deck. "They're blocking the way," Lognon whispered hoarsely. Maigret nodded, took a small box of matches from his pocket, lit them, and threw them toward the left corridor. The flames caught the oil slick on the floor, starting a small fire, enough to stop the pursuers. In that moment, he pulled Lognon and Valmont to the right, up the narrow stairs leading to the deck. The steel door opened with a howling wind, the rain lashing at his face, stinging. On deck, the darkness was broken by the yellow light of a small boat moored not far away. A tall, thin figure in a long coat stood motionless in the light, a wide-brimmed hat covering most of his face. "Gray roof," Valmont whispered, his voice losing its confidence for the first time. The other raised his hand, signaling something. Immediately, two men from the small boat rushed across on a narrow plank, guns drawn. Maigret knew he could not duel in these conditions. The deck was wet. The wind was strong, and Valmont was something they wanted to live rather than die. "Give him to them, and we'll get out," Lognon said quickly. "No," Maigret replied, his eyes never leaving the gray roof. "He is the last piece of the puzzle." The ship's whistle blew, long and drawn out like a warning. Somewhere offshore, the flickering light of a lighthouse appeared, and Maigret realized that if he could pull them all toward it, he might have a chance of bringing the matter to light. "Run to starboard," Maigret shouted. They dashed forward, skidding across the wet deck. As the gunfire rang out again, ahead, a thick anchor line stretched taut, leading to a small motorboat rocking violently beneath the waves. The only path to freedom, or another trap. Chapter 18. On the black waves, Maigret pushed Valmont into the motorboat first, almost throwing him into the wet seat. Lognon jumped after him, then dropped in last, still holding the gun in his coat pocket. The wind whipped, carrying the smell of oil and rust, and the whole boat shook as if it were about to fall apart. On the aft deck, Gray Roof stood motionless, only tilting his head slightly to watch them. No shouts, no curses, just an eerie silence, as if he had calculated every move. The engine roared to life and the boat launched, its bow sending up columns of icy water. Maigret held onto the cut anchor rope, his eyes fixed on the large ship, which was fading in the mist and rain. But he knew that the danger was not over. You think you can get away with it? Maigret Valmont raised his head, his smile returning. You're taking me exactly where I want to go. Lognan turned around where? Valmont glanced to starboard, where the lighthouse's flickering light fell on an old wooden dock, jutting out from the rocky island. From the darkness, dots of light moved flashlights, and the sound of another engine approaching. They will pick me up. You are just the postman. Maigret was silent, his hand tightening on the pistol in his pocket. He did not like games in which he was reduced to a pawn. But this time, perhaps the pawn still had a move. And the gray roof? Maigret asked in a low voice. Who is he to you? Valmont looked out to sea, his face showing a rare softness no one or all. He knows secrets that make both sides afraid, and I am just bait. The motorboat shuddered as it hit the big waves ahead. The wooden dock became clearer, and at the same time, from either side, two other boats rushed out, blocking their escape. Flashlights shone directly into their eyes, and warning shots rang out, cutting through the rain. Maigret turned to Lognan. We don't go into the dock. Go straight to the lighthouse. If we go out there, the waves will swallow us. Lognan protested. Either waves or bullets. Maigret replied and pulled the trigger. There was a dry crack, the bullet hitting the hull of the opposing boat. The engine roared louder, and the chase in the night began, with the waves as high as walls threatening to fall on anyone who was a beat slower. Chapter 19. Storm in the Bay. The wind howled in long, trumpet-like blasts, whipping columns of icy water into Maigret's face. The little boat heaved, then sank, rocking violently. Lognan leaned forward, holding on to the tiller, trying to keep the bow pointed toward the lighthouse. Behind him, the engine roared, and the beams of flashlights swept across the sea. A bullet lodged in the wooden plank just above Maigret's shoulder, and the splinters burned his cheek. He did not return fire, but crouched low, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, where the waves curved like a dragon's back. Valmont sat in the middle, his hands still bound, but his mouth kept on saying, "You are killing yourself." Maigret, once out there, the wind will break the boat, and if you enter the port, you will be shot, Maigret said hoarsely. A huge wave crashed against the port side, and Lognon swore. Maigret caught a glimpse of the huge black shape of the lighthouse, its rotating lights flashing. But at that moment, from the foot of the lighthouse, another boat rushed out, its engine roaring, and crossed their path. The driver was wearing a hood, but when he turned around, Maigret froze. Under the revolving lights, the face was eerily familiar. Maigret, the French Secret Service agent whom he had heard had died in the explosion in Le Havre 3 years ago. She held the pistol, pointed it at Valmont, without saying a word. The wind and rain seemed to tear between the two boats. All the light from the lighthouse focused on that moment. Valmont opened his eyes wide. You're dead." Maigret smiled, but there was something cold in her smile. "No, Valmont, only my file is dead." Her boat closed in, her hand tightening on the trigger. Maigret only had time to shout, "Stop!" but the gunshots were already ringing, mingling with the sound of the exploding waves. Valmont fell forward, the rope soaked in blood. At the same time, from behind, 2 pursuing boats closed in, surrounding both Maigret and Mireille in a deadly circle in the middle of a wild night sea. Chapter 20. The Secret of the Grey Roof. Maigret knew that if he was a beat too late, both he and Lognon would be crushed between the steel sides of the boat. He gripped Lognon's shoulders tightly and shouted over the wind, "Turn now!" Lognon turned the wheel sharply. Their boat skidded like a pebble tossed across the water, narrowly separating the 2 pursuing boats. One lost momentum and slammed into Morel's side with a loud metallic clang. In that moment of chaos, Maigret rushed to Mireille's boat. He grabbed her gun arm and held it down. Their eyes met, not the eyes of enemies, but of 2 people who had once fought together. "Why?" Maigret growled. Mireille breathed heavily. Rain and seawater dripping from her disheveled black hair. "Because the grey roof is more than a den of crime." Maigret, it is a network of the very people who are giving you orders. Those words were like a cold knife piercing Maigret's mind. He understood, but still asked. Valmont is the link. He holds a list, names, code names, and shipping routes that could cause several ministers to disappear from politics if leaked. I can't let it fall into their hands. The engines roared behind him again. The pursuers had regained the upper hand. Maigret raised the gun again, but this time handed it to Maigret. If you trust me, take me to shore. I will give you something that Valmont never had time to reveal. Maigret looked at her for a long time. In the flickering light of the lighthouse, he saw real fatigue, not an act. He signaled to Lognan head to the west bank, to the cliffs. They dashed through the waves, leaving the screams behind. As the boat's bow wheel scraped against the wet sand, Morel handed him a small leather-bound book, soaked with rain but intact. This is the gray roof. Maigret, if you open it, you will never have peace. She disappeared into the night before he could ask any more questions. All that remained was the sound of the waves and Lognan's rapid breathing. Maigret clutched the notebook in his hand, knowing full well that the case was closed. But the door to another storm had just opened. Chapter 21. Darkness in the ministry corridor. The next morning, Maigret sat alone in his office. The leather-bound notebook on his desk, like an object of unusual weight. He had not opened it. The smell of tobacco from his pipe, mixed with the scent of old leather, filled the room. The knock on the door was soft but urgent. Lognan entered, his eyes glancing quickly at the book. They asked about it. He whispered. Who? Maigret asked, his eyes still glued to his coffee cup. Not the press. It was from the ministry, and from people I had never heard of. They didn't come through the front door. Maigret nodded. That confirmed Mairet's words. The gray roof was more than a criminal gang. It was a network that penetrated the very heart of power. He opened a drawer, put the notebook in an envelope, sealed it, and gave it to Lognan. Trust no one. Take it to a place known only to you. If I don't call within 3 days, give it to a newspaper you trust. Lognan gaped. You intend to confront him head on. Maigret curled his lips, a tired but determined smile. We do not hunt small fish when the whole sea is rotting. When Lognan left, Maigret put on his coat and hat and left the Quai des Orfèvres. He did not go to his house or to his usual brasserie. Instead, he entered an ancient stone building near the Ministry of the Interior, whose long, silent corridors seemed to conceal centuries of intrigue. A man in a gray suit, with no name tag, was waiting at the end of the hall. He was smiling, but his eyes were empty. "Detective Maigret, we need to talk about a house with a gray roof." In an instant, Maigret understood that stepping through this threshold meant he would not only investigate a case, but also voluntarily enter a war where both enemies and allies were as vague as cigarette smoke in a closed room. Chapter 22. The Men in Gray Suits. The room they took Maigret into was cold and empty. There was a long glass-covered table, 2 chairs facing each other, and a low-hanging lamp that seemed to shine directly into his eyes. The man in the gray suit sat down first, adjusting his tie. His voice was smooth, but without any warmth. "We know you are holding something that does not belong to you. Detective Maigret." Maigret took out his pipe, filled it slowly, and did not answer at once. "And I also know," he replied, the smoke mingling with the light as it escaped, "that some people want me to hand it over without leaving a trace. If you cooperate, everything will end smoothly." Gently, Maigret raised his eyebrows, like the Pierre Lemoine case, like the way witnesses suddenly disappeared. A flash of caution crossed the man's eyes. He tried to regain his composure. "You are entering a game whose rules you do not fully understand." "Maybe, but I know enough to know that when the rules of the game are written by faceless people, only the bold dare to flip the table." The man smiled faintly, tapping his fingers on the table. "You have a family, you have colleagues. We also know who you trust the most." Maigret looked straight at him, his eyes heavy but steady. "Threats do not lessen my curiosity." There was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Finally, he stood up. "Someone else will come to see you, and when they do, you will have to choose." Maigret left the building, feeling as if he had just emerged from a giant cocoon, a web of power, and no one who got caught in it could escape. He knew the real game had only just begun, and the leather-bound book was now more than just evidence. It was a declaration of war. Chapter 23. Bait. Maigret arrived home later than usual. Paris had taken on a damp cloak of night, and the street lights cast a wet sheen on the cobblestones. He gently drew back the curtains and saw what he had expected, a black Citroen parked 2 doors down, its headlights off, but the silhouette of a man sitting still in the darkness. He left the living room light on. In the darkness, Maigret placed the briefcase on the table. But the genuine, leather-bound book was gone. He had hidden the original in the most unlikely place, in an old wooden compartment under the bar of a suburban tavern where he had solved the case 15 years earlier. What was in the briefcase was a photocopy with a few fake pages, deliberately left out in places that would give the person holding it the impression of knowing the secret. The phone rang. Lucas's voice was low and reserved on the other end. Boss, I saw 2 strange guys at the coffee shop down the street since you left. They weren't drinking anything, just looking out at the street. Let them think. We don't know, Maigret replied. But do one thing. Take the briefcase I left in the office to your house and leave it in a visible place. Boss, what do you mean? Bait. Lucas, if they get that book, I'll know who they're working for. That night, Maigret lay on the sofa, eyes half closed, but ears straining to hear every sound. Around 3 in the morning, a soft engine hummed and then died away. Then came footsteps on the sidewalk. Then the metallic click of a lock across the street. Maigret smiled in the darkness. The fish had taken the bait, but he also knew that when a man swallowed the bait, the hook did more than hurt, it dragged the fisherman into the maelstrom. Chapter 24. Wheel tracks in the mist. By the time the dark figure left Lucas's apartment with his briefcase in his hand, Maigret was already outside. He had not turned on the lights, nor was he wearing a thick coat. Only the collar of his coat was pulled up high to hide his face. The night fog was thick, covering the car windows and the pavement with a damp haze. The other man moved quickly, his steps sure and disciplined, as if he had been trained. He did not know that, from across the street, a stout man, slow but never losing sight, was following him around every corner. The black Citroen started. The thief opened the back door, stuffed the briefcase in, and got into the driver's seat. The car rolled smoothly, leaving faint tire tracks on the wet road. Maigret hailed a nearby taxi, saying simply, "Keep your distance, don't overtake, and turn off the interior lights." The driver glanced in his rearview mirror and recognized the voice and face of the famous inspector, but asked no further questions. They followed the citron through the silent streets, across the bridge over the Seine, and then turned onto a deserted road leading to the suburbs. Finally, the car stopped in front of a villa with high walls and a locked black iron gate, with only a weak yellow light shining from a second-floor window. Maigret wrote down the address in his notebook, his heart pounding. This was no ordinary burglar's hideout. This was the home of Armand Villeray, a former legal advisor to a large corporation. Once called by the press the man who never lost a lawsuit, Maigret did not approach. He stood in the shadows, lighting a cigarette, letting the smoke drift into the mist. Inside, those who believed they had trapped him had no idea. The briefcase was poison bait, and each page inside was leading them into another net, Maigret's net. Chapter 25. The White Paper Trap. The next morning, the Quai des Orfèvres office was still shrouded in a drizzle. Lucas entered, hanging his coat on the rack, but his eyes immediately went to Maigret's desk. On the table, his familiar pipe smoked quietly, and beside it was a large brown envelope. "Sir, the briefcase from yesterday," Lucas began. But Maigret raised his hand. There was nothing in it but 12 blank sheets of paper, each with a false seal. Lucas frowned, then understood. That means they'll give it away if they believe they've got the secret file. They'll have to discuss how to use it, and every call, every trip will be a milestone for us. Maigret pulled open a desk drawer, took out another stack of papers, actually copies of sensitive notes related to the case, and put it in the safe. At noon, the news came one of Villeray's old associates, Paulin Marchand, had left Paris early in the morning, driving toward the Belgian border. The second news came soon after an urgent telegram from the port of Le Havre announcing that someone had booked a ticket on a freighter to South America, using the name Jean Delorme, but the identification photo was Paulin. Maigret sat still, his eyes narrowing like mist slowly dissolving on a river. They are trying to get rid of the person or the evidence. Lucas, you and Janvier go now. Don't arrest him yet. Just let him believe that no one is following him. As they drove away, Maigret stood by the window, looking down at the rain-soaked traffic. He knew that the trap had begun to close, and that the shadowy figure was waiting for him to step fully into the circle. But he also knew that the game became more dangerous as it drew closer to its end. A cornered animal would bite the hardest. Chapter 26. The shadow at Pier 7, the smell of sea salt and engine oil mingled in the heavy air of the port of Le Havre. Lucas and Janvier stood behind a row of containers, watching the area of Pier 7. The cargo ship Santa Mercedes was preparing to leave that afternoon. Cranes slowly lowering the last of its cargo into the hold. Janvier handed the binoculars to Lucas. There he is, gray coat, hood pulled down. Paulin Marchand was standing next to a strange man, slim and wearing a dark suit despite the light rain. They exchanged a few brief words. Then Paulin held out a small object wrapped in oiled paper. The man did not open it, but put it in an inside pocket. Then pulled a thick envelope from his leather briefcase. Lucas whistled softly. No joke. Look at that envelope. They continued to watch. The man in the dark suit turned and walked toward a waiting truck. Paulin walked slowly toward the pier, holding the ticket and fake papers. Janvier leaned closer to Lucas. Shall we tell the boss now? Not yet. His orders are to let them think everything is going well. But don't lose sight of that truck. While Janvier followed the truck, Lucas stood still and watched Pauline board the train. Suddenly, from behind, a figure in a black raincoat approached and placed a hand on Pauline's shoulder. The conversation was so quick that Lucas only saw Pauline's hand tremble. Then he backed away, turning away from the train entrance. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. There was clearly a third party controlling this game, and that third party knew their every move. Chapter 27. Buried files. The phone rang in the office as Maigret finished pouring his beer. He picked it up and heard Lucas's voice mixed with the sound of the rain and the distant train whistle. Boss, something's happened. Pauline isn't getting on the train. A stranger intervened. Not sure who. Janvier is following the truck. Maigret put down his glass. His back slightly bent. His eyes narrowed. Description. Lucas spoke quickly, recounting every detail: the black raincoat, the hand on his shoulder, Paulin's stunned reaction. When he hung up, Maigret didn't return to his chair, but went straight to the old filing cabinet, opening the bottom drawer, where he kept cases that had never been clearly closed. His fingers stopped on a dusty file, its cover yellowed. The Jules the Fox Morel case, 1938. The photo in the file made him freeze for a few seconds. A slim man in a dark suit, a cold face, and eyes that seemed to see through the person's every thought. Exactly like Lucas's description of the man Paulin had met at the port. He pulled out another memo, which contained his own scrawling from years ago. Never show up alone. Always send someone else to do the dirty work. Maigret buttoned his coat and called Janvier. Listen. You're following an old fox. Don't push him. Let him lead us back to his lair. Outside, the rain was falling harder. The wet Parisian streets reflected the yellow lights, as if the whole city were covered in a glassy veil, where truth and falsehood were mixed. Maigret knew that this was more than a fugitive. It was opening an old wound, and this time he would not let it escape again. Chapter 28. The warehouse by the canal. Janvier stopped the car about 50 meters from the warehouse, turned off the engine, and let the wipers sweep slowly. The only light came from the rusted iron door, pale yellow and trembling as if about to go out. The steady sound of dripping water from the tin roof mingled with the sound of the canal flowing silently beside it. He stepped out slowly, pulling up his collar. The smell of mold, oil, and rust mixed together, making the air as thick as an old blanket. Through the crack in the door, he saw two figures moving, one short and stout, probably Paulin, the other tall, thin, wearing a hat. The Fox Morel. Janvier took out his walkie-talkie and whispered, "Boss, they're inside. They seem to be discussing something. There's no argument." Maigret's voice came from the other end of the line, low and firm. No interference. "We need to know what he wants from Paulin." There was a creak. The iron door opened wider. A third man stepped out, a rough-hewn man carrying a long, heavy cloth bag. Janvier backed away, hiding behind a wooden crate. As the man passed, he caught a glimpse of the top of a small wooden crate peeking out from inside the bag. The kind used to hide documents or something more dangerous. The rough man threw his bag into the back of the truck. Paulin and Morel followed. Paulin looking mesmerized, staring straight ahead. Morel smiled faintly, the smile of someone who has thought a dozen steps ahead. Janvier hissed into the phone boss. I think this is hot stuff. Maybe documents. Or something related to the 1938 port incident you mentioned. On the other side, Maigret was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Don't let them leave without a tale. This isn't just my past. Janvier, the whole unit will have to open their eyes." The truck started, headlights cutting through the rain. Janvier pressed on the gas and followed, knowing that tonight the chase would lead them to a place where secrets buried for decades awaited. Chapter 29. The Bridge Keeper. The rain had stopped, now falling only sparsely on the surface of the canal. Maigret stood under the yellow street lamp, his unlit pipe between his fingers. The dim light illuminated his deep-set eyes and cast a long shadow on the wet pavement. In the distance, the sound of Morel and Paulin's truck engine echoed, gradually swallowed up in the night. A clanking sound came from behind. Maigret turned. A gaunt old man in an old raincoat was locking the chain of the swing bridge leading to the warehouses. On his head was a crumpled cap, from which rain dripped with every movement. "It's late, my friend," said Maigret in a low voice. "For me, the night is the time to observe." "Inspector," replied the old man, without turning around. Maigret stepped closer, recognizing the wrinkled face, the eyes still sharp as knives. "You know me. Who here doesn't know Maigret? But I've known you for much longer. Since that night in 1938. Maigret paused. Dark memories returned the case at the port, the missing woman, and the traitor in the ranks. "What did you see that night?" Maigret asked. The old man chuckled, pulled a packet of oiled paper from his pocket, and opened it to reveal an old, yellowed photograph. It showed Morel, much younger, standing next to a wooden crate identical to the one Janvier had just seen. Beside him was a port officer, a man Maigret had suspected, but without sufficient evidence. They still use the same trick. And tonight I see it repeated. The old man said hoarsely, "Are you willing to be a witness if you promise? This time, justice will not be missed as before." Maigret nodded slowly, his hand tightening on his pipe. "I promise. But you must disappear for a few days. Don't let Morel know." From a distance, Janvier radioed Boss. The truck stopped at a warehouse on the south bank of the canal. There are many people there, and I think they are not just waiting to unload. Maigret looked up toward the dark south bank. The photograph in his hand felt warm, pulling him back into the game that both he and Morel knew this time. There would be no room for error. Chapter 30. The Trap in the Warehouse. The night wind whistled along the canal bank, carrying the smell of oil and damp wood. Maigret sat in the car, his eyes following the flickering light on the south bank. Janvier, on the other end of the line, kept his voice even, but a little urgent. "Boss, I count at least 7 people. They are not unloading. They are just standing there waiting." Maigret nodded slightly, as if Janvier could see him. "Keep your distance. Don't let anyone see you." He signaled 2 plainclothes policemen to quietly enter from the west. The swing bridge was locked, so the only way to get to the warehouse was by motorboat. They slid into the water, the small motor whirring like a mosquito. Inside the warehouse, dim yellow light illuminated rows of wooden crates as high as a man. The smell of strong alcohol mingled with the musty smell of fabric. The air was so still that even the sound of water dripping from the tin roof was audible. Maigret sensed this silence not as a sign of safety, but as a warning. He signaled a policeman to come forward and open the lid of one of the crates. It was empty. A second, a third, also empty, but under the floorboards, Maigret noticed a new cut, straight and clean. He bent down to check when. Bang! The back door slammed shut. The lights went out, and darkness engulfed everything. There was only the sound of the latch being locked, and then the footsteps running away. "Silence," Maigret ordered, his voice soft but sharp. He felt in his pocket for his lighter. A blue light flashed, enough to show the steel mesh that had just been pulled down from the ceiling, blocking the exit. "Boss, we're locked up." Janvier whispered, "No, this isn't just locked up. This is Morel's message. I know where you are." In the distance, a long, slow whistle sounded, like a bell. Maigret looked up, the light of his lighter reflecting in his eyes this time. He had stepped right into the middle of his enemy's chessboard, and his next move would be costly if he made a mistake. Chapter 31. The Predator's Gift. The lighter only lit for a few seconds, but it was enough for Maigret to see inside the wire mesh. In the corner of the wall, there was a small object wrapped in oiled paper. He signaled Janvier and another policeman to stay put, and slowly approached. The wooden floor creaked under each step, as if signaling someone outside. The package was thin, but tied with a navel cord, and the knot was tight. Maigret cut it open. With a knife inside was an old pocket watch. The face cracked. The hand stopped at 2:37. Attached to it was a small piece of paper, scribbled in pencil, "When the watch stops, blood flows." Janvier looked at his boss and growled, "He is playing mind games with us." Maigret did not answer immediately. He silently recited the timeline of the case. 2:37. That was the time the first victim was discovered, and also the time the camera at the train station was disabled. This was not just a threat, but a clue to the connection between the murders. "Do you hear that?" Maigret asked softly. The sound of a boat engine echoed in the distance. Getting closer. It was not the police. It was heavy and steady, like a cargo boat. Maigret took a deep breath and signaled for everyone to hide behind the crates. The warehouse door opened slightly. A shaft of light streamed in, accompanied by the clang of metal. The shadows of two men were cast on the floor, dragging a long object wrapped in canvas. They set it down in the middle of the warehouse, next to a pile of empty crates, and left without locking the door. Maigret waited until they had left before approaching. He pulled back the canvas. Inside was an iron suitcase with a combination lock. On the lid was a second note. "The key is with someone you never suspect." Maigret looked at Janvier. Their eyes met, and at the same time, a cold thought crept in. What if that person was right there on the team? Chapter 32. The Talking Suitcase. Maigret knelt, his calloused hands running lightly over the cold metal surface. He pressed his ear to the lid. There was no ticking, but it felt as if something inside was waiting to burst. Janvier leaned closer. "Boss, what if it's a trap?" "If it's a trap, it's not just for me," Maigret replied, his eyes never leaving the combination lock. 3 numbers, but no trace of where. He recalled the note The key lies with the person you never suspected. In an instant, the faces of his colleagues flashed through his mind like a fast-forward movie. "Do you remember the fire at the docks last year?" Maigret asked quietly. Janvier nodded, understanding. That time, only one person from the team had been present before the entire force was mobilized. And that was Lucas, the man Maigret still trusted completely. Maigret dialed 317, Lucas's date of birth. The lock clicked open. Inside, there was neither bombs nor gold, but an old tape recorder, still playing a tape. A hoarse male voice rang out, "If you're listening to this, Maigret, I've won half the battle. Every question you ask, every doubtful glance you give your teammates, that's my gift to you. When you find me, your own team will no longer be a team." The sound of ice stopped, replaced by the clanging of metal, the same sound as when the second victim was attacked. Maigret paused. This was more than a psychological attack. Morel had just used doubt to exploit his greatest strength and his most fatal weakness, trust. From outside the warehouse, footsteps echoed, heavy, steady, and familiar. "Boss, it's me, Lucas," the voice called softly, but enough to freeze the air. Chapter 33. Shadow of Doubt. Maigret did not turn back immediately. He kept his eyes on the tape recorder, as if it might reveal something more. But Lucas's footsteps were approaching steady, slow, without the rush of a colleague delivering urgent news. "Boss, I see the warehouse door is open. What's going on?" Lucas stood in the doorway, his tall figure blocking some of the light from the hallway. Janvier glanced at Maigret, his hand tightening on the gun in his pocket. The air was thick. Only the faint whirring of the old light bulb could be heard. "How did you get here?" Maigret asked, his voice low, each word seeming to cut through stone. Lucas shrugged. "I was on duty upstairs. I heard a noise. Thought it was someone strange, so I came down." Maigret took a step towards him, his eyes not leaving the slightest reaction. "And you think, in the middle of the night, a stranger will open the archive and leave me a suitcase?" Lucas was silent for half a second too long, long enough for Maigret to know the answer was not in the explanation. "Do you know what this code is?" Maigret asked again, his eyes boring into Lucas. No, sir. Why should I know? Maigret lifted the lid of the suitcase, revealing the tape recorder. Lucas's eyes flashed for a moment. It was hard to call it surprise or recognition of something familiar. Listen, said Maigret, playing the tape again. Morel's voice echoed in the closed room, as if he were standing right between them. When the tape ended, Lucas took a deep breath, then exhaled softly. You think I... He left the question hanging. Maigret did not reply. He took another step forward until the distance between them was just wide enough for an arm's reach. I think, in this case, if I am wrong, I will lose more than one life. Janvier gripped his gun tighter. Lucas looked over, his lips pursed, and said, If you really believe I'm involved, then I suggest we go down to headquarters right away. Tonight, I won't be out of your sight. Maigret looked deeply into Lucas's eyes, then nodded slightly. Good. But you go first. They stepped out of the warehouse. Maigret knew that. From this moment on, every step Lucas took would be a new and possibly final chapter of trust. Chapter 34. Paris at Night. Lucas's boots echoed in the empty hallway. Maigret followed, suppressing the doubts that swirled in his mind with each step. Janvier quietly locked the door to the storeroom and joined the last row, still looking around as if any shadow might be a gun. When they reached the street, Paris at Night opened up with a yellow light blurred in the cold fog. The light from the street lamps fell long on the wet pavement, reflecting the three figures like participants in a game of chess where all the pieces were pawns and all could be sacrificed. Maigret nodded slightly toward the taxi parked at the corner. Get in. Lucas stepped forward, but when he opened the door, he paused. There was no driver inside. There was only a blank sheet of paper neatly placed on the driver's seat. Maigret walked around and picked it up. A line of scribbled words, written in fountain pen. If you continue, a second person will disappear. The night wind crept through the slits of his coat, cold as the promise of death. Lucas looked down at the paper, then up. What is this, boss? Maigret folded the paper, his voice low. A reminder that we don't have much time left. He signaled to ignore the taxi, and the three of them continued walking down the narrow street leading back to the headquarters. Above, A window was half open, and a figure appeared and disappeared as the light in the opposite hallway came on. Maigret said nothing, but the feeling of being watched made his neck tingle. He knew this well. The person behind him was trying to force him to reveal his next move. And tonight, Maigret decided to let him think he had fallen into a trap. Chapter 35. The Decoy. The office on the Quai des Orfèvres was bathed in the pale yellow light of a desk lamp. Maigret sat motionless, his pipe between his fingers, the smoke curling slowly as if measuring the breathing of the room. Lucas and Janvier stood on either side, watching him expectantly. "We will do it his way," said Maigret in a low voice. "But with my rules." He opened a drawer, took out a file, and deliberately left it exposed on the table, stuffing a few blank sheets of paper inside, leaving only the cover stamped "Secret Picpus Affair." Maigret knew that if there was a leak in this headquarters, the file would be the perfect bait. "Janvier, you will accidentally let the night watchman know that I will bring this volume to the prosecutor's office at 10 a.m. But in reality, I will be somewhere else." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Where, boss?" Maigret looked out the window, where Paris was pitch black at night. The faint sound of the Seine River train whistle echoed in a place he believed no one dared to go. Around midnight, the plan was put into action. Janvier left the office first, pretending to be off duty, his bag heavy as if carrying a file. Lucas stayed by Maigret's side, and they waited. Each tick of the wall clock was like a needle piercing the tense silence. Suddenly, the phone rang. Lucas picked it up, put it to his ear, and looked at Maigret, his face changing color. "Boss," he said only one sentence. "Look over your shoulder." Maigret turned around. Through the glass door, on the roof opposite, a figure was standing, not moving, just silently looking straight at him, as if it had been there all along. Chapter 36. On the roof, Maigret put on his thick overcoat and signaled Lucas to turn off the light in the room. The room was plunged into darkness, save for a glimmer of light from outside. He pushed open the window, the creaking of its hinges a warning, but the shadow on the other side remained motionless, as if waiting. "Lucas, stay. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, sound the alarm, boss. No arguing." Maigret climbed out onto the balcony, taking care because the dew had made the surface slippery. He held on to the water pipe and climbed onto the roof. The wind whipped his face, carrying with it the damp smell of river and coal smoke. The shadow moved, not running, not hurrying, just retreating towards a large chimney. Maigret pulled out his flashlight, turned on a narrow beam. A face appeared, a thin, gaunt man with deep-set, glowing eyes, a look that was a mixture of defiance and fear. "You know who I am, Maigret," he said softly, his voice lost in the wind. "But if you take one more step, the truth you hold so dear will fall with me." "You won't dance," Maigret replied, his voice calm. "A man like you needs an audience." He laughed, a dry laugh, and then suddenly threw a small object at him. Maigret caught it, a cold metal lighter. 3 letters were engraved on the body, EDL. "When you know who it belongs to, everything will change," he said, and then retreated into the darkness behind the chimney. Maigret rushed forward, but when he shone his flashlight, there was only empty space and the sound of footsteps fading away on the roof. In his hand, the lighter was still heavy, as if it contained a secret enough to overturn the entire case. Chapter 37. The Trace of 3 Letters. The next morning, Maigret sat alone in his office, his lighter in the middle of his desk. The pale light coming through the window reflected the 3 letters EDL onto the white paper below, like a faint seal of fate. He lit his pipe, the smoke curling and disappearing, leaving behind a familiar, musty smell. The faces of the people involved in the case flashed through his mind one by one, but none of them had names or surnames beginning with E, D, or L, at least on official paper. Lucas entered, putting down a thick file. "Sir, I have checked all the people who appeared at the scene and on the witness list. No one exactly matches these 3 letters, but what Maigret looked up, there is a strange case, a woman whose birth name is irrelevant, but who used an alias in an old investigation, Elise de Lornay." Maigret recalled. 10 years ago, an international jewelry smuggling ring was busted. Elise disappeared just before the trial began, taking a large part of the evidence with her. The police found no trace, only rumors that she had cleansed up her past and was living under a new name. Lucas, find all her addresses, bank banks, and contacts from the past 10 years. And don't let anyone know we're looking. As Lucas left, Maigret returned with the lighter. His finger tapped the cold metal, a small object, but it could be the key to unlocking an old network that had been thought buried. He knew well if Elise was really involved. This was no longer a simple case. It was the return of a ghost, carrying debts that had never been paid. The rain began to patter on the roof, and Maigret felt as if he had just stood at a threshold. Once he had crossed it, there would be no turning back. Chapter 38. Ghost in the Hotel. The rain was still falling in a thin veil over Paris that evening. Maigret stood on the porch opposite the Hotel Le Clermont, his pipe warm in his hand, his eyes fixed on the revolving door. Lucas had reported Elise de Lornay, or whatever name she was now using, had booked a room here for 3 nights, paid in cash, and was not carrying much luggage. A black taxi stopped. The woman got out, wearing a long ash-gray coat and a wide-brimmed hat that half hid her face. But Maigret recognized her gait immediately. She leaned slightly to the left. Her right foot took shorter steps, as if avoiding an old injury. She entered the lobby unnoticed. Maigret followed slowly, stopping at the reception desk. He took out a pack of cigarettes, as if indicating that he was there to avoid the rain. From the corner of his eye, he watched Elise took the key, gave the clerk a vague smile, and disappeared into the elevator. Room 412, sir. The receptionist accidentally shouted when calling the porter. Maigret nodded slightly and left the lobby, but did not go far. He went around to the side door and into the hotel's small cafe, where he could see the corridor leading to the elevators. A moment later, the woman reappeared, this time without a coat, holding a small bag in her hand, an EDL lighter attached to a zipper. She did not look around, but walked quickly out into the crowd. Maigret stood up, put the money on the table, and followed. The street was wet, the yellow lights reflecting off the pavement. Elise led him through 2 corners, stopping in front of a narrow bar with no sign, only a flickering red light. She entered. Maigret hesitated for a few seconds, feeling his heart pounding. He knew there was more than one suspect behind that door. It could be an entire old network. People who had once killed to protect secrets. And tonight, he might have to face them all. Chapter 39. Faces in the Bar. Inside the bar, red light cast a shadow over the rotten wooden walls. The smell of old liquor mixed with cigarette smoke was thick. The old jazz music from the record player seemed to drown out all conversation in a quiet, almost hypnotic rhythm. Maigret stood in the doorway for a few seconds, like a wandering visitor undecided about where to sit. But in fact, he was keeping an eye out for Elise. She sat in the far corner, her back to the door. Opposite her was a man in a black suit, his silver hair combed back, sitting unusually straight. Maigret recognized him at once. Henri Valmont, a name that had been in the Sûreté's secret files. 5 years ago, Valmont had disappeared after a murder that no one had been able to prove. Maigret chose a table near the counter and ordered a glass of Calvados. Through the dim mirror behind the bar, he saw that Valmont spoke very little, mostly listening, while Elise kept leaning over to whisper. Occasionally, Valmont tapped his hand lightly on the table, an old habit of those who are calculating. Suddenly, the door to the tavern opened. A young man in a dark leather jacket entered. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were sharp. He glanced around the room, then went straight to Elise and Valmont's table, placing a thick envelope on it. Maigret leaned over and caught a few broken words, enough to shut up. No one will find out. Maigret's heart slowed, then beat harder. This was no longer a single murder. It was a chain, involving money, involving secrets enough to make people disappear forever. Valmont opened the envelope and took out a few photographs. Even from a distance, Maigret recognized them in the red light. One of them was of the victim of an old crime. On the night he was killed, and in the background, there was a face Maigret did not expect to see again. That face belonged to a high-ranking official at the Ministry of Justice. Maigret set his glass down gently. He knew that if he stepped forward now, everything would collapse. But if he delayed, Elise and Valmont would disappear again, along with the only evidence. Chapter 40. The U-Turn. Maigret stood up, as if he wanted to go out for a cigarette. But instead of going to the door, he walked slowly around to the corner of the cafe where Elise and Valmont sat. His footsteps faded into the jazz, but Valmont looked up, his icy silver eyes measuring the distance. Elise blinked rapidly, trying to hide her panic. "Hello, Valmont," said Maigret in a low, even voice. "Long time no see." Valmont smiled, but his hand tightened on the envelope. "Inspector, no. Should we say Monsieur Maigret is retiring? I never really took a break, and tonight seemed like a good time to come back." Elise stood up abruptly, but Maigret placed a hand lightly on the back of the chair, blocking her way. The cheap perfume from her hair mingled with the smoke, creating a heavy scent of old secrets. "We are talking like old friends," Maigret continued, his eyes never leaving the envelope. "Those pictures, I guess they will keep some people awake." Valmont shrugged. "You know, sometimes silence is the most expensive commodity. And who are you selling it to?" The air thickened. The young man in the leather jacket who had brought the envelope began to move, his hand slipping into his pocket. Maigret recognized the movement too quick and too neat to be unconscious. "Don't," said Maigret, just loud enough to be heard over the music. But he pulled out a metal object any. Maigret did not wait. He pushed the table, knocking over the wine bottle and the glass, the golden liquid spilling onto the wooden floor. In the chaos, he snatched the envelope from Valmont's hand. He lunged forward, but Maigret had retreated to the counter, holding the envelope high out of reach. The photos poked out of the corner, enough for Valmont to know he had lost the item. "The game is up, Valmont," Maigret said, his voice sharp. "And this time, you won't disappear so easily." A police siren sounded in the distance. Getting closer, Valmont glanced at Elise, then at the back door of the restaurant. He knew Maigret had arranged it. But before the police entered, Valmont had only one word to say as a warning. "You don't know what you've just touched, Maigret. This isn't just a case, it's a chessboard, and you've just set foot on the wrong square." Chapter 41. Shadow in the Hallway. The police station door closed behind them with a dry click. Valmont leaned back in his metal chair, his wrists cuffed, his expression half defiant, half contemptuous. Maigret placed the envelope on the table, not opening it yet. He knew that sometimes keeping criminals waiting made them talk more. "You won't find anything but meaningless pictures," Valmont said absently, "but I guess you'll try to find their meaning, and then you'll become part of the game." Maigret lit a cigarette, letting the smoke drift slowly around the room. He did not answer. but sat there, looking at Valmont as if examining an old piece of furniture for a crack. Outside in the corridor, the footsteps echoed steadily, but something was off. It was not the footsteps of a policeman on patrol. It was light, quick, and trying to make no noise. Maigret recognized it at once. "Janvier," he called, his voice low but urgent. The door opened, and the young policeman poked his head in. "Sir, check the east corridor immediately. There are people there." Janvier disappeared like an arrow. Maigret turned around and saw Valmont smiling, the smile of someone who knows the outcome of a game. "Do you really think you can just lock me up here?" he said. "There are people who won't let me open my mouth, just as they won't let you keep the things in that envelope." There was a sudden noise, the sound of the iron door at the end of the corridor being wrenched open. And then Janvier's shout mixed with the sound of running. Maigret grabbed the envelope, stuffed it into his coat pocket, and signaled to the two other policemen to guard Valmont. He walked quickly into the corridor, where Janvier was chasing a figure in a black raincoat and a hood that covered his face. The stranger ran toward the back door, holding what looked like a pocket knife. Maigret did not pursue, but cut a shortcut, blocking the door. But when he reached out to grab it, the shadow did not attack. Instead, it threw another envelope to the floor and disappeared into the rainy night as if it had never existed. Maigret bent down to pick up the envelope. There was no name on the outside, only a handwritten note. "Drop this, Maigret, if you want to live." Chapter 42. Message from the Invisible Man. Maigret stood in the damp, rain-scented corridor, the cold envelope in his hand. He felt its weight not in the paper inside, but in the message, a warning or a death sentence, depending on how you looked at it. Back in the interrogation room, Valmont glanced at the envelope and chuckled. "Ah, so they were quicker than I thought. Are you going to open it? Or will your imagination kill you first?" Maigret did not answer immediately. He took a box cutter and lightly cut the edge of the envelope. Inside was a small piece of paper, neatly typed. "Stop. The man you seek does not exist on paper, but he exists long enough to erase you and everything you hold dear. No signature, no identifying marks. Only in the lower left corner, a reddish-brown stain spread in the shape of a fingerprint." Maigret observed carefully, took a drag of his cigarette, his eyes never leaving Valmont. "It seems your friend is very afraid that I will continue." Valmont shrugged, but his eyes flashed with unease. "Friends? I have no friends. Only those who play the same game. And when the piece is turned over, it is discarded, like me." Janvier returned, reporting that he had found no trace of the man in the raincoat. The back door led to a narrow alley from which one could branch off in several directions. Maigret decided to keep the paper, sending it down to the technical department to be checked for fingerprints. But deep down, he knew the trace could lead to a name he had heard somewhere, from a case many years ago. A case he thought was closed. The intercom rang, making the atmosphere even more tense. Maigret picked up the phone, and Lucas's voice came from the other end, urgent. "Boss, a woman has just arrived, insisting on seeing you. She said, if Maigret wants to live, listen to me tonight." Maigret glanced at Valmont and saw that he was smiling very slightly, the smile of someone who knows that a new piece has just been placed on the chessboard. Chapter 43. A Date in a Foggy Tavern. The La Seine Tavern was nestled in a riverside street. Its sign faded, its pale yellow lights hovering in the damp mist. Maigret pushed the door open and entered. The doorbell rang softly. The scent of old wine and cigarettes mingled into a familiar but vaguely uneasy scent. In the darkest corner, a woman sat waiting, a wide-brimmed hat covering most of her face. Her fingers tapped a rhythm on her wine glass. The rhythm like a code. Maigret came over and sat down opposite. "You were the one who sent me a message." She looked up, her eyes steely gray, her voice low and hoarse, as if she had endured many sleepless nights. "I don't have much time. They're watching us both." Maigret frowned slightly. "Who are they?" She leaned forward and whispered. "The same group behind Valmont. They don't kill for money. They kill for memories. Anyone who knows too much or has seen something they want buried will disappear. And I'm on that list." She nodded, her lips pressed together. "Not just you. There's a witness you haven't found yet. A man who used to work in the building where the victim lived. He holds the key to the whole story. But if you don't find him by dawn tomorrow, he won't breathe again." Maigret felt his throat dry. Outside the glass door, a figure stood smoking, the smoke curling around him like a curtain. The woman placed a small piece of paper on the table and slid it towards him. Address. But don't use your car. Don't let them see you coming. She stood up, not looking back, and disappeared into the thick fog. Maigret watched, clutching the piece of paper in his hand. He knew this was no ordinary case, but a game of shadows where every step could be the last. Chapter 44. The Room at the End of the Hallway. Night was falling heavily, and drizzle clung to Maigret's collar as he turned into the alley marked on the piece of paper. The neighborhood seemed abandoned. The buildings were silent. The windows shuttered, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the rusted cracks. Number 17 was obscured by the yellow streetlight. Maigret had no key. The wooden door was ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. He stepped inside, feeling damp and cold. The long corridor, the ceiling lights flickering, each step echoing strangely. He pulled his hand from his pocket, holding the pistol tight. At the end of the corridor, a door was ajar, letting in a faint light. Maigret leaned closer, heard a gasp mixed with the clanking of metal. He pushed open the door, and the room appeared. A thin, disheveled man was trying to undo an iron padlock wrapped around an old wooden chest. "Are you Bernard?" Maigret asked softly. The man jerked up, eyes wide with panic. They knew I would talk. They're everywhere." Maigret moved forward, intending to reassure them, when a sharp noise came from the corridor. The door slammed against the wall. Heavy footsteps approached. Bernard turned pale and whispered, "It's too late." Maigret turned immediately, pushing Bernard behind the chest, his eyes scanning the room for an escape. But there was only a small window. The bars rusted. The first dark figure stepped through the threshold, the steel glinting in his hand. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if signaling that tonight the silence of the neighborhood would be torn apart by gunfire. Chapter 45. Gunshots in the dark. Maigret leaned aside, avoiding the flash of the blade. The first shot rang out, a deafening bang echoing through the small room. The shadow paused, then sped forward, as though accustomed to danger. Bernard cowered behind the chest, his hands clutching the wooden frame until they bled. He stammered, "There are two more out there." Maigret knew he was not lying. The footsteps in the hallway were approaching, fast and heavy, creating a rhythm that seemed to mark the seconds he had left. he fired a second shot, forcing the knife man back out the door. A brief silence. Then the sound of breaking glass at the window. Maigret turned. A hand reached in from outside, trying to unbolt it. He did not expect Maigret to rush forward, bring the butt of the gun down hard on the wrist. The sound of dry bones rang out. The hand disappeared into the darkness. Bernard Maigret ordered, "Stay right behind me. Don't leave." They rushed into the corridor. The ceiling light flickered, creating dense shadows. Bernard's rapid breathing mingled with Maigret's footsteps. But at the head of the corridor, two figures blocked the way, one with a gun. Maigret paused for half a second, long enough to notice the cold gaze of the gunman. He smiled as if he had anticipated his every move. And then, from the street outside, came the sound of a police siren, long, sharp, like a fragile thread connecting him to a chance of survival. Chapter 46. Siren and Shadow. The siren sounded once more, echoing through the open window, making the whole corridor vibrate. The two men, blocking the corridor, glanced at each other. In that split second, Maigret had pushed Bernard against the right wall and was rushing straight at his nearest opponent. The shot rang out. The bullet whizzed past his shoulder, burning like a burn. Maigret slammed his body into the gunman. Feeling the heavy impact as they both hit the wall, the gun flew out, rolling across the floor, the metal glinting in the flickering lights. The other man rushed forward, but Bernard, trembling, his face pale, suddenly picked up the fallen gun, his hand shaking but still pointing it at him. "Back off," Bernard growled, no longer as weak as before. For a moment, the corridor fell silent, except for the sound of the police sirens, which were getting closer and closer. But Maigret noticed something unusual. The sound was not coming from the front of the building, but was gradually receding. "They don't come here," Maigret whispered. The man holding the knife smiled slightly, then signaled to his accomplices with his eyes. With just a strong jerk, the ceiling light went out, and the entire hallway was plunged into total darkness. In the darkness, Maigret could hear footsteps running away, but not in the direction of the door. They were leading him somewhere else. Chapter 47. Underground Labyrinth. The darkness was so thick that it seemed to swallow everything. Maigret followed the sound of footsteps. feeling the cold, damp wall slide through his hands. A cold wind blew up from below, carrying the smell of mold and rusted metal. "Bernard, stay there," his voice rang out, but only a faint echo answered. An iron door slammed shut behind him, the bolt screeching, cutting off all escape. Maigret found himself being led down a spiral staircase, hidden in the old structure of the building. The walls were not new concrete, but ancient bricks, covered with moss, indicating that this passageway had existed long before the building had been renovated. Beneath his feet, the stone floor was crumbling and damp. The sound of someone's boots echoed ahead, rhythmically enticing. Every time Maigret accelerated, the sound receded, keeping just enough distance for him to miss. At the end of the narrow corridor, a dim yellow light shone through a crack in the door. Maigret leaned closer and peered through. Inside was a low-ceilinged room, the walls covered with maps of the city, red dots connecting the locations in a zigzag pattern. On the desk were thick files, numbered and carefully bound together with string. A deep, hoarse voice rang out, "He's in the right place. There's no turning back now." Maigret knew he had just touched the center of a conspiracy bigger than any case he had ever investigated. Chapter 48. The Man in the Dark. Maigret pushed open the door and entered, the hinges creaking slightly as a signal to those inside. The two figures standing by the table immediately parted: a tall, thin man with deep, cold eyes, and a woman in a dark cloak, her lower half face hidden in shadow. "You came sooner than I expected, Maigret," the man's voice said, not Bernard's, but low and slow, as if each word had been carefully considered. "And who are you?" Maigret kept his voice even, his eyes darting around the room, taking in every detail: maps, files, an old tape recorder on the table still spinning a tape. The woman smiled softly, her laughter mixed with sarcasm. "Titles are meaningless. The important thing is that you know too much." Maigret realized that this was more than just a simple murder case. The red lines on the map linked a series of seemingly disparate cases over the years, and the reluctant witness was just a small link in the chain. The tall, thin man approached and placed a thick envelope before Maigret. "If you are wise, you will take this and forget what you saw." Maigret did not move. The yellow light fell on his face, highlighting the deep lines that looked as if they had been carved by a knife. He knew that if he left this room, he would either take with him evidence enough to break the entire network, or he would disappear like so many names that had disappeared into the darkness of the city. Outside, the river boat whistle echoed like a distant warning. Chapter 49. The Flip. Maigret lifted the envelope, his palm still, as he felt its weight, not just papers, but a web of buried truths. He looked straight into the tall, thin man's eyes, his voice cold as iron. "I will not forget anything." A dry laugh from the woman. "You've always been stubborn, Maigret. But let's see if you'll still be stubborn when you know what's inside the envelope." Maigret slowly opened the envelope, taking out photographs, handwritten letters, copies of contracts and confidential papers, all arranged in a deliberate manner. But that was not all. At the bottom of the envelope was a small device that emitted a faint red light, a mini recorder. He turned on the machine. A man's voice rang out, cold and clear. If you could hear it, this case would not be buried. All evidence, all statements are recorded. Anyone who dares to touch a link in the chain will suffer unforeseeable consequences. The tall, thin man stepped closer, trying to stop Maigret from turning off the machine. But he had expected that. With a twist of his hand, Maigret turned the volume up to full. The sound of the tape filled the room, stopping everyone. The room fell eerily quiet. The tapes recording secret conversations, threats and plots to silence witnesses. Maigret looked straight. This is only the beginning. I will bring this matter to light, whether you like it or not. The woman started, and the tall, thin man smiled bitterly. "You don't know what you've just touched, Maigret. But anyway, this game is far from over." Maigret smiled slightly and walked out of the room, leaving two figures in the yellow light. Outside in the corridor, the train whistle sounded like a promise of justice or tragedy. Only time would tell. The end. Light and darkness. On the final day of the investigation, the sky over Paris was gloomy. Thick clouds wrapped around the Eiffel Tower as if to block out all light. But in the conference room at Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret stood tall, holding a thick file in his hand, his eyes determined. Before him, Police chiefs and journalists waited, eager, but also skeptical. Maigret began to lay out the puzzle piece by piece evidence, tape recordings, witness statements, and exposed conspiracies. His voice echoed. Without hesitation, this is not just a murder case. This is a criminal network that has operated in the shadows for too long, with the protection of the powerful. But no darkness can cover the light of truth. The files were handed over to the prosecutor, and those who had thought themselves safe now faced the law. Lucas stood next to Maigret, looking at him with respect and unshakable trust. That night, as Maigret stepped out of the headquarters, the rain began to fall, softer and purer than usual. He raised his head, letting the rain fall on his face, feeling a rare serenity after months of hardship. But in the darkness, there are still figures silently watching. The war is not really over, and Maigret knows. On the path of justice, light and darkness always go hand in hand. Each victory is just a new turn, leading to secrets yet to be revealed. He lit a cigarette, smiling to himself. This game, I have many more moves to play, and Paris, with its rain-covered alleys, will continue to witness the silent footsteps of the detective who never stops searching for the truth.